So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the pathophysiology of pain. Pain is the most common symptom that brings patients to medical attention. The function of the pain sensory system is actually very protective. It protects the body and maintains homeostasis. And it does that by helping to detect, localize, and identify any potential or actual tissue damaging injuries. Pain is defined as an unpleasant sensation that is usually localized to some part of the body, and it's often described in terms of a penetrating or tissue destructive process. So, for example, we describe pain as being stabbing or burning, twisting, tearing, or squeezing. And it also triggers an emotional reaction. It can be terrifying, it can cause nausea, it can make people sick. Pain of moderate or high intensity is also accompanied by anxiety and an urge to escape or terminate that feeling. So pain is really considered to be both a physical sensation and also really an emotion. There is a true emotional component of pain that is very, very real, and it's also got a very strong neurological basis. Acute pain is characteristically associated with what we call behavioral arousal, meaning that we get worked up, and a physical or physiological stress response, which is consisting of all the things that you think of with a stress response: increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, dilated pupils, increased plasma cortisol levels. We also see muscle contraction, so limb flexion, usually to withdraw the limb from a painful stimulation. And we also see abdominal wall rigidity. We sort of bear down when we feel pain. Now, how do we actually sense pain? The word nociception is defined as the physical sensing of pain. And a nociceptor is a neuronal cell, a nerve, that senses painful stimulation. Now, we find and since pain is a sense, these nerves are going to be afferent nerves. So we do have a set of primary afferent nociceptors, and these primary afferent nociceptors, or these nerves that convey pain, there's a few of them, they are found within peripheral nerves, and those peripheral nerves start off as spinal nerves before they then branch out to all targets in the body. Now, peripheral nerves consist of axons of both primary sensory afferents and motor neurons. Okay? But of course, we're not talking about the motor neurons here. We're talking about the afferent fibers. So primary afferents are usually classified based on their diameter, how large they are, their degree of myelination, and how fast their conduction velocity is. The largest diameter afferent fibers are called the A-beta fibers. And the A-beta fibers respond to things like light touch, moving stimulation across the skin, and they're present primarily in nerves that innervate the skin. Okay? So these are fibers that, when they are stimulated, they do not produce the sensation of pain. So these A-beta fibers are not our nociceptors. And if I just skip to the next slide here, what we have is actually a representation of one of these peripheral nerves. Here's a cross-section of a portion of spinal cord. And what we see is we actually have three different basic types of fibers found in these peripheral nerves. And you can see the largest diameter fiber is these A-beta fibers. Okay, so these A-beta fibers are basically our somatosensory fibers. They convey basic physical sensations of touch and movement across the skin, but they are not our nociceptors. Okay, they do not convey pain. The other two afferents are responsible for conveying painful stimulation. Now, these are smaller diameter fibers. The first is the myelinated A delta fiber, and the other are unmyelinated C fibers. Okay. So the A delta fiber, the myelinated A delta fiber, and the unmyelinated C fibers. Okay. And generally speaking, the A delta fibers are very good at conveying low intensity painful stimulation, while the C fibers tend to convey high intensity painful stimulation. Okay. And by painful stimulation, I'm referring to things like noxious stimuli, like intense heat or cold, intense mechanical stimuli, like a pinch, changes in pH, especially acidity, application of things like chemical irritants, and we're talking about both endogenous and exogenous chemical irritants. So exogenous irritants can be any number of things coming from the outside world. But endogenous irritants tend to be basically inflammatory mediators and also some components of intracellular fluid. So things like potassium are very irritating to these nerves. So one more word about these primary nociceptors, A delta and the C fibers. If you notice that the C fibers, there's two C fibers drawn. One of these C fibers is projecting into the dorsal root, into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and one C fiber is actually projecting into a sympathetic ganglion and then into the spinal cord where the autonomic ganglia, where the autonomic nerves project into. So the C fibers that are running alongside those A deltas and are projecting into the dorsal horn, those are somatosensory. Okay? So they are conveying painful stimulation coming from the surface of the skin and we are conscious of that. Okay? So they are coming from the surface of the skin. The other C fiber that projects into the sympathetic postganglion, the sympathetic chain, this is a visceral afferent. This C fiber is conveying visceral pain, okay, or visceral stimulation. So if, for example, there is death of myocardial tissue or ischemia to myocardial tissue that triggers inflammation and pain, that pain is going to be conveyed through this C fiber that goes into the sympathetic chain. Okay. Now, when we injure, let's say, an area of our body, like a cut to our skin, a laceration to our skin, what we know or experience is that the area of the wound becomes extremely sensitive. Okay? Even the lightest touch becomes painful, and in fact, even an area surrounding the laceration becomes very tender. Okay? And so even the lightest touch that would normally not even be painful to an uninjured area of the body, all of a sudden becomes painful. So this process is, what causes this is a process called sensitization. And this is when intense, repeated, or prolonged stimulation is applied to damaged or inflamed tissues. And basically, the threshold for activating these pain afferents, these nociceptors, is lowered. Okay? And the frequency of their firing becomes much higher for all intensities of stimulation. Okay? So even the lightest stimulation in terms of, let's say, touch, will stimulate these nociceptive fibers. Okay? So this sensitization is the sensitization we see when there's tissue injury, and in a variety of inflammatory mediators actually, mediators contribute to this process of sensitization. So let's consider the two stages here. So we've got primary activation, secondary activation, and really what this means, primary activation is happening at the site of injury. So at the site of injury, we've got some cell damage and death. And when cells die for reasons that we actually talked about earlier in the semester, their intracellular material becomes very acidic, and when that cell dies and lyses, the acidity gets released into the extracellular fluid. We also have the release of intracellular potassium, and then as a result of inflammation and cell damage and inflammation, we get the production of prostaglandins, that's what PG is, and the production of things like bradykinin, right, the kinins, that's what BK is. Now, all of these mediators, in addition to just the pain of the initial injury, all of these mediators are stimulating, increasing the excitability of this nerve ending, of this nociceptor nerve ending. Okay. So even in, so this increased excitability, okay, this increased excitability of this nerve ending is sensitizing this nerve ending, okay, which means that even the lightest touch on this area of injury is going to trigger pain because this pain receptor is already highly excited by all these mediators. Okay. So that describes the area, the primary activation, the area of injury. Now, the area of injury, when it conveys pain, that pain signal not only is conveyed to the spinal cord, but if we look over here in B, that pain signal is also actually conveyed to other branches that are innervating the surrounding areas of the skin. Okay. So these branches on the left and on the right are actually nerve endings that are connected to the site of injury, but are actually conveying pain from the surrounding areas of the skin. So this pain message comes down through this primary location, and then it goes onto the spinal cord, and it also goes down these branches. And as it moves down these branches, it causes the release of something called substance P. That's the SP in this slide. Now, substance P is going to do a variety of things. It's going to trigger mast cells in the area. It's going to stimulate platelets. Okay? And platelets and mast cells are players, if you recall, in the inflammatory response. And they release things like histamine and serotonin. And histamine and serotonin are going to increase the excitability of this nerve ending, okay? Just like we saw acidity, potassium, prostaglandins, and bradykinin do in this first slide, in this first part of the slide. Okay. So the substance P released is going to trigger these inflammatory cells to release more inflammatory mediators that are increasing the excitability of this nerve ending. And then on the other end, you see the substance P is being released into the bloodstream, and it's triggering bradykinin, okay, which is also sensitizing this branch. So now, not only is the area of the injury sensitive, very, very sensitive to pain, but also now the surrounding area is highly sensitive. Okay. So the sensitization is created by both the release of cellular debris and cellular metabolites, and the mediators of inflammation, and then the sensitization of the surrounding skin is also caused by primarily inflammatory mediators. And as you would imagine, this is very protective. Sensitization is designed to stimulate you to protect that wounded limb, okay, so that you cover it, you shield it, you protect it from any further injury. Okay, so this is very protective. Pain is a very unpleasant sensation, but it is very, very important, and it's very protective. Another aspect of pain is something called referred pain. Now, referred pain is defined as the spatial displacement of pain sensation from the site of injury that produced it. And we can think of referred pain as being primarily visceral pain, so a painful stimulation coming from a visceral organ, and instead of us feeling it exactly where the organ is, oftentimes the pain is felt as some sort of pain on the surface of skin, okay, or the surface of the body. And so we have actually some predictable areas of the body that we feel different types of visceral pain. So the right shoulder, the right upper abdominal quadrant, we feel things like liver, gallbladder pain. The heart we feel on the left chest, the shoulder, down the left arm, even up into the jaw on the left side sometimes. Okay. The colon we can feel in the middle of our abdomen, the small intestine we feel in the epigastric region, the stomach in the epigastric region. So we have a fairly predictable pattern of referred pain for different types of visceral pain. Now, the mechanism for referred pain, the predominant theory is one of convergence. And the idea is that when we feel pain in a visceral organ, let's say here the kidneys, okay, that pain is being conveyed by those C fibers that we looked at earlier, that ultimately are going to converge onto a spinal nerve. Okay. Now the convergence onto the spinal nerve, it's converging with some sort of somatosensory afferent nerve. Okay. And it's including not just the somatosensory nerves that convey things like light touch, but also our somatosensory nociceptors, right? Those alpha, those A delta and somatosensory C fibers that are coming in. And so the idea is this convergence, when the visceral pain comes in, it is and then moves up to the brain. It is perceived by the brain as the pain that originates in the kidney. The brain perceives that pain as coming from the corresponding surface of the skin or the corresponding dermatome for that spinal nerve. Okay. So this convergence theory is the overwhelming explanation or the prevailing explanation for this process of referred pain. But essentially, referred pain is visceral pain. And so knowing this pattern of areas of the body that correspond to different types of visceral pain can be very important when evaluating a patient's pain, determining whether it's actually coming from a visceral organ or coming from actually coming from the surface. Now, pain that's felt at the surface of the skin, as we mentioned before, is sensed by these peripheral nociceptors. And it's conveyed into the spinal cord, right? And I showed it as being terminating at that dorsal horn. Now, there is an ascending pathway that carries that pain signal up through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, and then ultimately at the brain. So the prevailing ascending pathway for pain involves an ascending pathway. So you see the the nociceptor comes in to the dorsal horn, and then it quickly crosses over to the contralateral side, and it enters the white matter, and it ascends through what we call the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract is the white matter tract that carries afferent fibers up to brain centers. And so it moves up through the spinal cord, it moves through the midbrain, and then it eventually terminates onto the thalamus. Okay? And that's why we call the spinothalamic, because it's going to terminate on the thalamus. The thalamus is a major relay station for a lot of ascending projections. And remember, this is the contralateral thalamus to where the injury originated. Now, from the thalamus, this painful stimulation, this pain message, is going to be conveyed to two basic areas of the brain. The one area is the somatosensory cortex. Okay. Now, this somatosensory cortex, this projection to the somatosensory cortex is responsible for the purely sensory aspects of pain. So just our ability to know that we do feel pain, it allows us to localize the pain, to know the intensity and the quality of that pain. Purely sensory. The other projections are to broad areas of mostly frontal cortex, and it includes areas like the anterior cingulate area and the frontal insular area. Now, these areas of the frontal cortex are responsible for the unpleasant emotional aspects of pain. This projection is responsible for basically what we experience as the suffering associated with pain. Okay? So the somatosensory cortex is that sensory component, and the frontal cortex projections allow us to perceive the pain, to actually interpret the pain, and produces that unpleasant emotional aspect of pain. Now, we also have a descending pain circuit. Now, this descending circuit is not producing pain so much as it modulates a pain message. So we actually have inputs that originate in that frontal cortex, okay, that part of the brain that allows us to think. We have descending portions from the frontal cortex and also the hypothalamus that relay to the midbrain and then down the medulla, and it ultimately is going to control the spinal pain transmitting cells. So those afferent nociceptors that are coming in, this descending pathway is going to control their activity. Okay. Now, this means that the brain has the ability to control this, the ability for this pain message to actually even get into the spinal cord and then move up and be felt. Now, this network is described as the pain modulation network. And this pathway is thought to explain why pain is such a highly subjective experience, why one type of injury for one person doesn't seem to be as painful as perhaps another person. So psychological variables like expectation, memory, and fear can actually work through this system. It's thought to work through the system to either worsen the experience of pain or lessen the experience of pain. So, for example, if a woman is having a baby and she has the strong belief that labor and birth is a scary and intolerable experience, then she may actually have a higher level of pain than a woman who has a different expectation of labor and birth. Okay? So these psychological variables, our higher order brain is actually able to modulate, either make it worse or better, our ability to feel pain. And so these pain relieving strategies that are non-pharmacological, like distraction, diverting somebody's attention, or making strong suggestions, such as strong suggestions about how they may feel the pain, whether it's better or worse, actually is thought to also work through this pathway. And interestingly, each of the components of this pathway, all the cells involved, also contain opioid receptors and are thought to be the targets, or at least some of the targets, for opioid drugs. So the pain relieving or the analgesic effects of opioid drugs may be working through this already present pain modulation network by stimulating it. And also, very interestingly, all of these components also contain and release, are thought to release, endogenous opioid peptides. So our body makes its own set of opioids in the form of what we call enkephalins and beta endorphins. And this suggests that this pathway may actually represent an endogenous opioid pain relieving or analgesic pathway. And so the question is, how do we stimulate or take advantage of this endogenous pain relieving pathway in order to ease people's pain? And there's a lot of theories behind that. So I'm going to end there, and we'll talk more about this in our live lecture.